Megan never imagined that the husband she had known as a simple man would be a secret heir. The news came too late. She was already carrying 2 babies in her womb. Shocked, she faces suspicion and intrigue as she approaches the world of high society. But an even bigger revelation is about to change everything. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Megan pressed one hand against her belly the moment she stepped through the tall wooden doors of the mansion. The entrance hall soared overhead, complete with an ornate ceiling painted in swirling pastel scenes. Lustrous marble floors gleamed under the delicate glow of a chandelier that looked larger than the entire dining area of her own apartment. She felt dwarfed by the luxury, and her pulse quickened with every step. The twins moved restlessly, as if sensing her nervousness and the stares she was already attracting. Her outfit, chosen with care that morning, suddenly felt too plain against the grandeur surrounding her. She tugged lightly on the hem of her dress, hoping no one noticed her anxiety. Standing by her side, Brandon placed a gentle hand on her arm, giving her a quick, supportive squeeze. Though he wore a confident smile, there was tension in his eyes. A circle of relatives gathered in the wide foyer. Megan counted at least 10 people she had never met, a flurry of cousins, uncles, aunts, all wearing neutral or polite smiles. She gave a small wave, unsure if she should speak first or wait for Brandon to make official introductions. One older woman in a dark green dress looked Megan up and down, then offered a cool nod of greeting. Megan swallowed, forcing a polite smile. Brandon led her into a lavish dining room just off the main entrance. The table, a gleaming stretch of polished wood, was set with crystal glasses and pristine white linens. The centerpiece of fresh flowers nearly obscured the faces of the guests already seated. An older man with a rigid posture and a near-permanent frown sat at the head of the table. Brandon guided Megan toward him. "Grandpa," Brandon said, bowing his head slightly. "This is Megan." The older man lifted his gaze, his steely eyes giving Megan a once-over. He gave the slightest inclination of his head. "Welcome," he muttered, voice grave. It wasn't quite a greeting, more of a formality that let Megan know exactly where she stood in the family hierarchy. She murmured a thank you, still holding the small of her back protectively. The twins kicked again. She suspected they felt every chilly glance cast her way. A middle-aged woman rose from her seat, glass in hand. "To the new additions to the family," she said. Her voice rang with forced brightness. "Both to Brandon's wife." She paused, eyes flicking to Megan's belly, "and to the little ones on the way." She raised her glass, and the rest of the table lifted theirs in response, though Megan couldn't help noticing how many faces avoided looking directly at her. Brandon whispered in Megan's ear, "It'll be okay," before pulling out a chair for her. She settled in, acutely aware of the hush that seemed to fall around her. As the servers began placing plates of delicate appetizers in front of them, Megan tried to look comfortable, but her shoulders remained tense. A flurry of conversation broke out, mostly among the older relatives. Megan caught phrases like inheritance, company shares, and expansion plans. She tried to piece together what they were talking about, but it was difficult with the way everyone seemed to speak in code. From time to time, she heard her own name, uttered quietly and with a certain edge. She glanced at Brandon, hoping he would clarify, but he only managed a tight-lipped smile. At one point, a cousin leaned over the table, speaking in a whisper that nevertheless carried to Megan's ears. "Are you sure she's ready for this?" The comment stung, but she feigned ignorance, folding her napkin in her lap as if she hadn't heard anything. They moved through the courses with slow deliberation, soups in small porcelain bowls, crisp salads with artisan dressings, entrees that seemed almost too perfect to eat. Megan, normally with a healthy appetite, found herself only picking at her food. The tension in the air dulled her hunger, and the glances she kept intercepting made the meal feel endless. Brandon would periodically stroke her arm under the table in silent reassurance, but his own posture was rigid. After the final course, a dainty dessert drizzled with what looked like edible gold, everyone stood and drifted into the great hall. An older cousin volunteered to show Megan the family portrait gallery. Caught between fascination and discomfort, Megan followed, with Brandon a step behind. The hallway leading to the gallery was lined with portraits so large and ornate that they might have belonged in a museum. Somber oil paintings showcased stern-faced ancestors, each frame carved with intricate patterns. She tried to admire the artwork, but her mind swirled with unease. Something about the day felt off. She'd known Brandon came from a more privileged background than she did, but walking through these corridors, she realized she had only scratched the surface. She felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness about her simple upbringing, and though the family had welcomed her formally, their warmth seemed questionable. Approaching one of the last portraits, Megan paused. It showed Brandon, perhaps in his late teens, standing next to a tall man in a crisp business suit with a slight frown. The painting's plaque bore a date from several years before. She'd never heard Brandon talk about a father figure dressed so formally or that particular phase of his life. Curious, she reached out to get a closer look, but a passing aunt cleared her throat sharply. Megan retracted her hand, feeling like she had crossed an unspoken boundary. They reconvened in a smaller parlor for conversation and coffee. Megan tried her best to make small talk with a few of the younger family members. One cousin, who seemed slightly friendlier, told her about the mansion's great traditions, including strict protocols for anyone who joined the family through marriage. There was a hint of sympathy in the cousin's voice, as if to say, "I know this is overwhelming." Shortly afterward, Megan found herself near a wide window that overlooked the estate's sprawling gardens. She was alone for a moment, letting her shoulders relax. Outside, fountains sparkled in the afternoon light, and rows of bright flowers seemed almost choreographed. The world out there looked peaceful, contrasting sharply with the guarded atmosphere inside. She felt Brandon approach before she heard him. "Hey," he said softly, placing a hand at her waist. "I'm sorry this has been so formal. I wanted to ease you into meeting everyone, but grandfather insisted on a luncheon first." Megan studied his face. "You never told me your family was this traditional," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I just feel out of place." "I know," Brandon finished quietly. "I thought I could keep some details of my family's, background private, especially because I didn't want that to define our relationship." His words were cryptic, but Megan only had time to nod. A presence behind them made her turn. The older man at the head of the table earlier, Brandon's grandfather, was standing there. With an austere lift of his chin, he gave a curt nod. "I trust you're comfortable," he said, though the question felt more like a statement. Then he glanced at Megan's midsection. "We're all looking forward to the children," he said, but without any outward sign of affection. Megan tried to smile politely in return, a knot twisting in her stomach. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of lingering goodbyes, forced compliments, and unspoken judgment. Megan's cheeks ached from the polite half-smiles she kept pinned to her face. As dusk approached, she and Brandon excused themselves with promises to return soon for another gathering the following week. They stepped out into the large front driveway, where the last rays of sunlight streaked over the manicured lawn. A faint breeze cooled Megan's warm cheeks. She was relieved to be out of the mansion's charged atmosphere. Brandon opened the car door for her, and just as she was about to slip inside, she caught a snippet of conversation from two distant relatives who had stepped onto a side path to chat. One of them said, "He'll have to reveal his hidden fortune eventually." The other person tisked in agreement. "Can't keep that kind of wealth a secret forever." Megan froze. A chill crept up her spine as the words sank in. She had known Brandon's family was well off, but a hidden fortune? What else had he not told her? Heart-pounding, she turned to look at Brandon. He was too busy unlocking the car to notice her reaction. Her mind spun with questions and fears, all swirling into one electric jolt of realization. This family wasn't just well off. They might be hiding a fortune beyond her wildest imagining, and that meant Brandon could be far more complicated than she had ever dreamed. As they step outside the mansion, Megan overhears someone mention Brandon's hidden fortune. Shocked, she realizes for the first time that Brandon might be far wealthier and more complicated than she ever imagined. Megan closed the door behind her with a soft click, her heart still racing from the unsettling luncheon they had just left. Brandon slipped off his jacket and tried to meet her eyes, but she stood by the hallway mirror, back rigid, arms crossed over her chest. She couldn't hold in her questions any longer. "What hidden fortune are they talking about?" she demanded, voice quieter than she intended but tense with anger and disbelief. Brandon rubbed his forehead, clearly troubled. "I wanted to tell you, but there was never a perfect time," he began. His hesitation only stirred Megan's frustration, so she walked into the living room, leaving him to follow. She needed space, needed to breathe, but most of all she needed answers. A short silence hung between them as they settled onto the sofa. Finally, Brandon cleared his throat. "I wasn't trying to lie to you," he said. "I just omitted some details about my family." Megan let out a brittle laugh, pacing across the living room. "That's a generous way of putting it. Your relatives, especially your grandfather, basically run an empire. And you never thought I deserved to know?" His gaze dropped to his hands. "I always struggled with my family's money. Growing up, I saw how it could change people. When I left for college, I decided I'd live on my own terms. I never thought I'd fall in love so quickly, or that we'd start a family. Telling you seemed like a bigger and bigger hurdle the deeper we got in our relationship." Megan's voice wavered, anger mingled with hurt. "Do you realize how betrayed I feel right now? We're married, Brandon. We're about to have twins. I can't even trust that I know who you are anymore." She fell silent, recalling the early days of their relationship. She'd been a new hire at the local events company. He'd been working a regular desk job with no suggestion of aristocratic roots or hidden wealth. They bonded over cheap coffee and late shifts, joking about struggling to pay rent on time. They had laughed together, complaining about bills and dreaming of simple vacations. Standing here in their modest living room, it struck her how false some of those moments felt now, knowing he'd had access to a fortune all along. Her phone buzzed, interrupting the tense quiet. Brandon glanced at it, then leaned back. "It's probably my mother. She always checks in after family gatherings." Megan shook her head, ignoring the call. "I'm not ready to talk to anyone except you." She sank into the couch, the cushions enveloping her. "So you come from this dynasty of hoteliers," she said carefully, "and your grandfather controls all of it?" "Basically," Brandon agreed. "The fortune is massive. It's tied up in the family's global hotel chain. My father and uncles have shares. Now that I've married and am about to have children, my share is relevant too." She exhaled, pressing a hand to her belly. The twins seemed to flutter, or maybe that was just her own anxiety. "This changes everything. Why were you so scared to tell me?" Brandon reached for her hand, and she let him hold it, though the touch felt different. There was a fragile tension in it. "I didn't want money to define us. I've watched relatives marry into the family and get stuck in these stiff roles, forced to keep up appearances. I wanted our life together to be genuine." She looked at him, eyes brimming with conflicting emotions. "So you hid something huge from me. I appreciate the sentiment, but it's still a betrayal of trust." Before he could respond, the phone on the coffee table buzzed again, lighting up with an incoming call. Megan snatched it up, ready to silence it, but the caller ID read, "Mom." Brandon motioned for her to answer. She put the call on speaker, and an elegant, slightly strained voice filled the living room. "Megan, dear," Brandon's mother greeted, "just checking in to see if you made it home safely. Grandfather was so pleased to meet you." Megan raised her brows at Brandon but answered politely, We got home fine, thank you. Well, the mother continued, Grandfather might have come off a bit stern, but he's been waiting for Brandon to settle down for years. We'll be in touch soon about upcoming events. With that, the call ended as abruptly as it began. Megan set the phone down, chest tight. She could still taste the tension from the luncheon. This is real, she whispered, more to herself than to Brandon. Your family is expecting us to play by their rules, aren't they? Brandon nodded slowly. You heard my grandfather. If we want a stake in the inheritance, we have to follow the family protocols. And I'm worried that if we don't, we'll be cut off completely. No support, no help, nothing. With a shaky breath, she picked up her own phone and began tapping. The family has a website, right? She typed rapidly, pulling up a glossy homepage showcasing luxury hotels in cities around the world. Smooth, jazzy music played in the background. She scrolled through the images of lavish lobbies, plush suites, and well-dressed staff. A wave of panic crested in her mind. She was used to budgeting groceries, discussing how to save a little for the twins' future. Now she was looking at gilded ballrooms that probably cost more than their entire apartment building. I feel like I'm in a dream, she said softly, or maybe a nightmare. Brandon joined her on the couch, gently placing a hand on her growing belly. Feeling the slight movements of the twins, he whispered, I'm sorry I kept this from you. I just never wanted us to be about money or legacy. I wanted us to be real. For a moment, they shared a sense of closeness. The background hum of cars outside, the cozy glow of the single lamp in their living room. This was their normal life, the one they'd chosen together. Megan clung to that comfort, exhaling softly. So, what do we do now? She asked, looking him in the eye. He pulled her in for a brief, earnest embrace. We face the family. If we don't show up for the demands, they'll consider us out of the will. I hate it, but it might be our only option. The grandfather's influence loomed in Megan's mind. She remembered his stern gaze, the way he'd barely acknowledged her at lunch. If your grandfather is this controlling, are we sure we want to be involved with him? Brandon pressed his lips together. I'm not sure of anything anymore. But if we refuse, we'll never be able to stand up to him or make our own decisions. He'll just write us off. Night settled over them, and Megan found it impossible to sleep. She lay awake, thinking of her background, her life before Brandon, and how simple everything had seemed. Now, with her twins on the way, the thought of inheriting a massive fortune was dizzying. Yet the possibility of being rejected by his family, losing the financial support they might someday need, made her stomach twist in knots. She finally dozed off only to wake up before dawn with a new wave of anxiety. They look down on me so much, she whispered into the darkness. Will my babies be looked down on too? Brandon's drowsy voice came from the pillow beside her. Don't say that. They'll be loved. By you, yes. But what about your grandfather? What about those aunts and cousins who stared at me like I was some con artist? In the morning, she put her feet firmly on the carpet and made up her mind. She would fight for her place in this family, if only to protect her unborn children from any scorn or unfair treatment. Brandon tried to be supportive, though his own doubts surfaced every time she brought up the tension. After breakfast, a sharp knock sounded at the door. A courier in a crisp uniform stood in the hallway, extending a thin, gold-trimmed envelope. Brandon signed for it, brow furrowed, and handed the letter to Megan. She tore it open, heart thudding. Inside was an elegant invitation printed on heavy cardstock, complete with swirling calligraphy. It invited them both to a weekend event at the family mansion, attendance requested by the grandfather himself. Megan's stomach lurched. She skimmed the text, quickly spotting the last lines mentioning that the family wished to see both Brandon and Megan participating fully in this official family gathering. She read it again, more carefully. Her eyes landed on a specific phrase in small print at the bottom. This event is mandatory to confirm the status of inheritance claims." She blinked, feeling the weight of each word. The reality sank in. Brandon leaned over her shoulder, reading silently. His hand tightened on her arm in a silent show of support. At the bottom of the page, in the corner, was a handwritten note. "Your presence, Mrs. Kingston, is required as well." Megan's breath caught in her throat. "They want me there too." Megan pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders as she and Brandon stepped out of the car, the towering iron gates of his family's estate looming ahead. This time, a uniformed guard waved them through without so much as a question, clearly expecting their arrival. She glanced at Brandon, whose expression was impassive, though tension bristled in the set of his jaw. He offered her a slight nod, and she drew in a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever awaited them inside. They drove up the curved driveway, past a meticulously manicured lawn dotted with neatly trimmed hedges. At the end of the path stood the mansion, majestic and unyielding. Its tall columns and arched windows exuded the same kind of severity Megan had felt at the previous luncheon. She could see lights glowing in the windows and caught the faint sound of voices. Tonight, it seemed, more relatives had gathered to witness her next meeting with Brandon's grandfather. An attendant quickly took the car away, leaving Megan and Brandon standing at the entrance. A door swung open, revealing a butler in a sharp black suit who greeted them with a curt bow. Brandon held Megan's hand as they stepped inside. The chandelier in the foyer sparkled, reflecting a warm glow off the polished floors. Despite the welcoming light, an undercurrent of unease moved through Megan's chest. They were guided through the hallway, past the large portrait gallery where she had glimpsed Brandon's stern ancestors. She remembered how out of place she'd felt that day. That same sensation now returned tenfold. Brandon's grip on her hand tightened subtly, and she appreciated the silent support. In the grand salon, a group of relatives was already gathered around a table set with white linen and elaborate centerpieces. Everyone turned to watch them enter, and Megan felt the weight of their collective gaze. Seated at the head of the table was Brandon's grandfather, his imposing figure clad in a tailored suit. His eyes honed in on Megan the moment she crossed the threshold. "Welcome," he said in a voice that commanded the room's attention. The conversation in the salon quieted instantly. "I trust you've accepted our invitation with due seriousness." Megan inclined her head in a polite greeting. "Yes, sir. Thank you for having us," she managed, trying to keep her voice even. Inside, her stomach churned with anxiety. Someone pulled out chairs for her and Brandon, and they settled in. Distant relatives, aunts, uncles, and cousins studied her with an unreadable mix of curiosity and skepticism. The older relatives sat with stiff postures and pursed lips, while a few of the younger ones whispered and cast occasional sympathetic looks in her direction. She caught the eye of the cousin who had given her a mild warning last time. The cousin offered the faintest smile as if to say, "I know this is hard." After a few murmured greetings, the chatter died down. The grandfather steepled his fingers on the table. "Thank you all for attending this important gathering," he began, glancing around. "It's not often our family convenes in this manner, but special circumstances call for more formal proceedings. Brandon, you've made certain decisions that affect your stake in the family's inheritance, and thus you've brought Megan into our midst." His gaze shifted to her, full of challenge. "Tonight, we will address how things must move forward." Megan felt the twins shifting in her belly as though they sensed the tension too. She swallowed hard, remembering how he had barely acknowledged her pregnancy at the luncheon. Now he was speaking in carefully chosen words that suggested this was a serious test. The tone reminded her of a court hearing more than a family dinner. "Please," Brandon said, clearing his throat, "Megan and I want to hear exactly what's expected of us so we can make this work." There was an audible scoff from somewhere down the table. Megan ignored it, focusing on the grandfather who nodded once. "I've built this family and its ventures on discipline, tradition, and careful selection," he said. "Anyone who joins through marriage must respect our customs and prove they're capable of upholding the family name. That means you, Megan." The old man paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "Therefore, I require that you reside on the estate for a period of time. You'll learn our ways, attend our gatherings, follow our rules. You will show us your commitment to our family and its enterprises." A ripple of shock passed through Megan. "Live here?" She flicked a glance at Brandon, who looked visibly uncomfortable, but he said nothing against his grandfather's decree. She tried to keep her voice steady. "May I ask for how long?" "That depends on you," the grandfather replied curtly. "We'll observe your conduct, your willingness to adapt. If at any point you decide you cannot cope, the arrangement ends, and so does Brandon's portion of his inheritance." Megan's stomach dropped. The blatant threat cut through any illusions that this might just be a simple test of etiquette. By staying here, she'd be under the family's constant scrutiny. But if she refused, she and Brandon would face a life estranged from his powerful relatives. She let out a tight breath, thinking of the twins. No matter how she felt about the family's controlling nature, she owed it to her children to consider the opportunity. "I understand," she said softly. A middle-aged aunt, tall and immaculately dressed, spoke up from across the table. "Our traditions are strict for a reason. Over generations, they've protected us from unseemly intrusions." Her gaze flicked to Megan, an unsubtle hint at her disapproval. "We must ensure that anyone who marries respects our legacy." Megan nodded, forcing a small smile that did nothing to mask her nerves. She could sense that some relatives agreed with the aunt, while others eyed Megan curiously, perhaps waiting to see how she'd respond. A quieter voice chimed in, belonging to the younger cousin who had shown Megan subtle kindness before. "Let's not forget we want to support Brandon and Megan. That includes giving her a fair chance to learn, not just criticizing everything she does." The cousin spoke carefully, glancing at the grandfather to gauge his reaction. He gave the cousin a short nod as though tolerating the interruption but not exactly endorsing it. Then he turned back to Megan. "Regardless, the terms stand. You'll stay here. Begin learning our ways. We have an etiquette coach who will come in a few days. You'll attend our social events, represent our name with dignity, and do it all under this roof. If you manage to satisfy me by the time the twins arrive, perhaps we'll consider you part of the family." Megan steadied her breath, aware of all the eyes on her. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said, though the words tasted strange on her tongue. She didn't want to appear ungrateful, but there was no denying the corners of this arrangement felt more like a trap than an invitation. The conversation fizzled into smaller clusters after that. A pair of uncles discussed hotels in Europe, while an aunt boasted about visiting a new spa in an exotic location. Megan couldn't help feeling as though they were ignoring her, yet she knew every one of them was keenly aware of her presence. Brandon tried to engage her in light conversation, but the tension weighed heavily, making every attempt feel forced. At one point, a butler directed them to a lavish dinner set up in the dining room next door. The same polished wood table from before glistened under the soft glow of overhead fixtures. The meal began with delicate hors d'oeuvres and continued with perfectly plated dishes. No matter how beautiful the food looked, Megan's appetite remained strained, her thoughts preoccupied with the looming decision she'd just made. She fiddled with the edge of her napkin, scanning the silent expressions around her. A few family members tried to draw her out with polite queries, asking if she was feeling well in her pregnancy, if she had any experience in philanthropic events, and other half-hearted small talk. She answered as pleasantly as she could, but she felt every inch of the power imbalance in the room. Brandon would glance her way now and then with an apologetic look, but he seemed uncertain of how best to support her without challenging his grandfather's authority. Eventually, dinner ended, and conversation faded into a lull. Megan and Brandon stood to leave, preparing for the long drive back. Relatives offered formal goodbyes, though no one moved to hug Megan or wish her well. It was all a theatrical display of politeness, empty and distant. She sensed that the true test would begin only when she set foot in the mansion as a temporary resident. She was nearly out of the salon when a hand gripped her elbow gently. Startled, she turned to see Brandon's grandfather standing there, his intense gaze fixed on her. He spoke in a low tone only she could hear, his expression like carved stone. "This is your last chance to prove you're worthy of my grandson and our name." Megan arrived at the estate at the crack of dawn, exhaustion and a hint of dread weighing on her. She had a single suitcase in hand, just enough to get her through what she hoped would be a short but necessary stay. A crisp morning breeze rustled the ivy clinging to the mansion walls as she ascended the wide marble steps. The front doors swung open before she could even raise a hand to knock, revealing the formal butler who greeted her with a silent bow. With a last, uncertain glance at her car, Megan stepped inside. She noticed instantly how the atmosphere differed when Brandon wasn't right beside her. He had stayed behind for a day or two to take care of some last-minute tasks, which left Megan feeling alone in this palatial home. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating a foyer that seemed larger than life. A stiff-faced maid approached, introducing herself as Camilla and pointing out the direction of Megan's assigned suite. Up the grand staircase and down a corridor lined with portraits she walked, noticing for the second time how the eyes in those paintings seemed to follow her every move. The creak of her footsteps on the polished wooden floor served as the only accompaniment in the silent hall. Finally, Camilla paused at a double door. "Your room, madam," she said, opening the door to reveal a spacious suite, high ceilings, tall windows overlooking the manicured gardens, and a bed so large it felt almost too luxurious for one person. Megan set her suitcase on a velvet bench at the foot of the bed, murmuring a thank you to Camilla. She wandered around, letting her fingers trail across the intricate carvings on the furniture. Everything felt pristine and unwelcoming, as though she'd stepped into a curated museum rather than a family home, and this was supposed to be her temporary residence. She was still taking it all in when a polite knock rattled the door. A prim older woman entered, a professional etiquette coach apparently. She introduced herself as Miss Robillard, curtsying slightly. Her lips curved in a thin smile, and her posture exuded the same disciplined grace Megan suspected she'd soon be forced to learn. "Good morning," Miss Robillard began. "We'll start immediately with posture training, as it's foundational to all our lessons." Before Megan could object, the woman gestured for her to stand in front of an ornate floor-length mirror. She produced a small hardcover book from her bag and placed it on Megan's head, directing her to walk slowly around the room. Megan had to concentrate fiercely to keep the book balanced, wincing each time it threatened to slip. She was a grown woman, yet it felt oddly humiliating to be tested like a schoolgirl, especially while pregnant. After what felt like ages, Miss Robillard had her practice a formal greeting, involving a slight bend of the knee, hands clasped politely at her waist. Megan's ankles grew stiff and her back ached, but she did her best to endure. Thoughts drifted to the twins. She silently prayed the stress wasn't harming them. By mid-morning, she was desperate for a break. When the lesson ended, Megan carefully lowered herself into a carved wooden chair. Miss Robillard gave a curt nod. "We'll practice again after lunch, focusing on dining etiquette. Until then, please review these notes." She handed Megan a neat stack of papers outlining all sorts of protocols, from which utensils to use for each course to how to hold a teacup properly. Megan's head swam as she scanned the pages. This was more than she ever bargained for. During lunch, she found the dining room mostly empty. A few distant relatives flitted in and out, none lingering long. An austere aunt sat at the far end of the table, giving Megan a once-over before returning to her meal. No one offered conversation. The only sounds were the clink of silverware against china and the subdued shuffling of servants. Megan tried to recall the lessons from the papers, gingerly holding her spoon in a delicate grip. She felt self-conscious, aware of eyes that might be checking her every move. The soup tasted good, but the tension in the room stole any real pleasure from eating. In the early afternoon, she strolled through the garden to find a moment's peace. The manicured hedges glistened under the sunlight, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. She paused by a trickling fountain. Its quiet murmur offered a temporary reprieve from the formality that suffocated her inside. A figure approached from behind, a younger cousin, the same one who'd shown her a flicker of kindness before. "Are you surviving?" the cousin asked, half smiling. "The first days are always the worst." Megan sighed. "It's a big adjustment. I feel like everyone's watching me, waiting for me to fail." The cousin shrugged lightly. "They are, in a sense. But try not to let it crush you. Some of us want to see you succeed, especially for Brandon's sake. He's the best of this bunch." The cousin's tone was kind, but a shadow passed over their face. "Just be careful around some of the aunts and uncles. They don't like outsiders." "Outsiders," Megan echoed, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. The cousin nodded apologetically and excused themselves. Megan lingered by the fountain for a moment longer, breathing in the crisp air. Then she braced herself to return indoors for the next round of lessons. Later that day, Miss Robillard led Megan to a private dining room for a practice dinner. Rows of silver cutlery were laid out in precise order. There were multiple forks and spoons of varying sizes, delicate crystal glasses for different wines or water, and she even saw a small bowl for rinsing fingers if needed. Each piece had its place in an elaborate ballet of table etiquette. Megan's mind spun as she tried to remember which spoon was for soup, which fork for the salad, and which one was reserved for the fish course. She fumbled a few times, prompting a curt correction from Miss Robillard. By the time they finished, Megan was both mentally and physically drained. She excused herself to her suite, heart heavy with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. She longed to talk to Brandon, to feel his reassuring presence beside her. Instead, she found herself alone in the vast room, enveloped by silence. She prepared for bed, placing her phone on the nightstand, half hoping for a message from him. When it didn't come, her spirits dipped further. That evening, before dinner, she heard a knock on her door. She expected Miss Robillard again, but instead she met a friendly maid carrying a small tea set. The maid introduced herself as Rosa, her shy smile reflecting genuine warmth. "I thought you might want something soothing before the next meal," Rosa said softly, setting the tea service on a small table by the window. "It can be tough on newcomers." Megan poured herself a cup, grateful for the small kindness. "Thank you, really. I appreciate it," she said, and it occurred to her that Rosa might be her first real ally here. Megan asked her a few questions about the mansion's schedule, wanting to avoid any unintentional missteps. Rosa answered quietly, telling her about breakfast times, the family's penchant for punctuality, and which rooms were off-limits unless accompanied. Megan detected the faintest warning in her voice. Stepping outside the rules could bring trouble. When Megan headed downstairs for dinner, she tried to summon every bit of decorum Miss Robillard had taught her. She stood straighter, walked more gracefully, and did her best to appear calm. Many of the older relatives were already at the table, sipping from crystal glasses. They glanced up as she entered, offering polite but cool nods. She noticed the haughty aunt from earlier, who barely masked her disdain. Megan kept a pleasant expression, mindful not to show how nervous she really felt. The meal began uneventfully, but every time Megan reached for a piece of silverware, she felt her heart flutter, worried she might pick the wrong one. She maneuvered through small talk about the estate's gardens, the weather, and polite curiosities about her pregnancy. No one asked about her own life experiences or her hobbies. It seemed like her only purpose in these discussions was to answer their questions and prove she could fit into their mold. After dinner, the family moved into a drawing room for a short round of tea. The grandfather did not appear this time, perhaps occupied with other matters or intentionally avoiding her. Megan relaxed marginally, though the environment still felt thick with expectation. She spoke briefly with an older uncle about travel and hotels, doing her best to seem genuinely interested, even though much of his conversation revolved around boastful tales of business deals. Night had long since fallen by the time she excused herself to go upstairs. As she made her way through the dimly lit corridor toward her suite, her legs trembled from the day's stress. She wanted nothing more than a warm shower and perhaps a quick phone call with Brandon to ground her. But just as she approached her door, voices drifted from around a corner. Two cousins stood there conversing in hushed tones. "I found it in grandfather's study," one whispered, sounding urgent. "It's a clause in the will. If she fails at these tests or wants to walk away, Brandon loses everything. Everything." The other cousin sucked in a sharp breath. "Then we know how important this is. If she doesn't measure up, well, you know what that means for Brandon's inheritance." Megan froze, pressing herself against the wall to avoid being seen. Her heart pounded so fiercely she feared they might hear it. The conversation continued, detailing how the family's power hinged on strict adherence to tradition, but the words blurred as Megan's anxiety soared. This was more than just dinner manners and polite smiles. The future of her family, and the twins, depended on her performance here. She fought the urge to confront them, instead listening, breath quickening with every passing second. The cousins eventually slipped away, their footsteps echoing in the hall. Only then did Megan dare to step forward, her entire body trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. She realized just how high the stakes had become. Failure was not an option, no matter how unjust or overwhelming these demands felt. In the hallway before bed, Megan overhears a cousin discussing a secret clause in the family will, something that could strip Brandon of everything if Megan fails. She's more determined than ever, but also terrified. Megan awakened to the first light creeping through the heavy drapes, her eyes bleary from a restless night. Memories of the whispered conversation in the hallway still echoed in her mind. The idea that her performance here could strip Brandon of everything tore at her. She took a steadying breath and slipped out of the plush bed, heading for the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. Her reflection showed tired eyes and a lingering worry that seemed to dim her usual warmth. She touched her growing belly, silently reassuring the twins that everything would be fine, that she'd find a way through this. Downstairs, the estate was already humming with muted activity. A few staff members hurried about their chores, carrying fresh linens or trays of silverware. Megan tried to offer a friendly smile as she passed, though most simply nodded politely and continued on their way. She reached the morning room where breakfast had been laid out. The array of pastries, fruits, and delicate sandwiches was impressive, yet she had little appetite. She forced herself to take a seat, reminding herself the babies needed proper nourishment. Across the table, an older aunt eyed Megan over the rim of a porcelain teacup. Her gaze flicked momentarily to Megan's slightly rounded belly before returning to Megan's face. "You seem pale," the aunt commented. "Are you sure this environment isn't too much for you in your condition?" Megan swallowed a sip of tea, the taste turning bitter in her mouth. "I appreciate the concern," she managed, keeping her voice calm. "I'm just a bit tired. It's been an adjustment living here." "Life in this family can be demanding," the aunt said, setting down her cup. "We have a certain image to maintain. People rely on us to do things the right way." Before Megan could respond, the aunt brushed imaginary crumbs from her sleeve and rose to go. The subtext was clear enough. Megan had better keep up. Left alone, she nibbled a corner of toast, steeling herself for whatever the day might bring. Etiquette lessons, prying eyes, and the knowledge of that clause weighed on her heavily. Soon, Miss Robillard arrived in the morning room, politely but firmly reminding Megan of her next session. They proceeded to the large reception hall, where Miss Robillard had arranged chairs and marked spaces on the floor with discreet pieces of tape. "We'll work on formal entrances," the coach explained. "Your posture must exude confidence and grace." Following directions, Megan walked the length of the hall, stopping each time she reached a marked spot, then greeting an imaginary host. She tried to focus on maintaining the perfect posture, yet her thoughts drifted to the conversation she'd overheard. If she failed at these tasks, the entire future she and Brandon had imagined might crumble. The pressure felt suffocating, but she pressed on, refusing to let her worry show. By midday, her lower back ached, and her mood soured. She excused herself briefly to rest in the small alcove near the hall. The soft cushion of an armchair provided some relief. She glanced out the nearby window into the courtyard. A black sedan pulled up, and a pair of well-dressed men emerged, business associates by the look of them, each carrying a sleek leather briefcase. Their serious faces reminded her of how the family's hotel empire reached far beyond these mansion walls. That empire was where the real power lay, and she had barely scratched the surface of understanding it. Her session with Miss Robillard ended, and Megan spotted a chance to investigate a bit on her own. She ventured to the family library, a quiet space filled with rows of books, old and new. It was a stately room, bathed in golden midday light. She'd hardly set foot inside before hearing muffled voices around one of the towering shelves. Moving carefully between shelves of leather-bound tomes, she overheard two uncles whispering. "Have you checked the accounts from last quarter?" one asked. "There's a suspicious gap again." The other uncle hissed, "Keep it down. If anyone discovers how we're moving the funds—" Their conversation stopped abruptly when a heavy volume slipped from Megan's hand, thudding onto the floor. She froze, heart pounding. The uncles peered around the corner, eyes narrowing. Realizing she couldn't hide her presence, Megan stooped to pick up the book. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I was just browsing." She avoided their stares, placing the book back on the shelf. Neither uncle spoke, but their suspicious, intense gazes followed her as she left the library. Her pulse hammered as she walked away. A seed of doubt sprouted in her mind. This family didn't just manage lavish hotels. They might be involved in something far murkier. The uncle's alarm at her presence made it clear they didn't want any scrutiny of their financial activities. She headed to her suite, shaken by the possibility that hidden corruption lurked behind the mansion's polished facade. Later that afternoon, she tried to distract herself by visiting the garden, hoping the open air would clear her head. She ambled down the stone path, letting the scents of roses and freshly turned earth calm her. A young gardener approached, offering a timid smile. "It's nice to see someone here. Usually the family doesn't wander around much unless there's a formal gathering." Megan returned the smile gratefully. "I needed a break. Everyone seems so busy or guarded. It's hard to know what's really happening behind closed doors." The gardener lowered his voice. "I've been working here for 2 years. Trust me, a lot happens behind those doors. People are protective of their secrets." He gave a quick glance around before returning to trimming a hedge. Megan thanked him and walked on, a renewed sense of unease swirling in her chest. By early evening, Brandon finally arrived. She met him in the front hall, her relief palpable. He gave her a quick hug, looking worn but determined. "I'm sorry it took me longer," he said. "How have things been?" Her eyes welled up despite her effort to stay composed. "It's overwhelming," she admitted, leading him to a quieter corner away from prying ears. "There's so much pressure. I'm doing these etiquette lessons non-stop, and some relatives keep giving me the cold shoulder. Also, I overheard—" She hesitated, not sure how much to reveal about the suspicious conversations. Brandon gently placed a hand on her belly, feeling the slight movement of the twins. "I hate that you're going through this. I wish we could walk away, but I'm afraid of how my grandfather might react, especially if he disinherits me. But more than that, I want our children to have every opportunity and for us to be part of the family that's also mine." The worry in his eyes reflected hers. She swallowed the knot in her throat. "I'm trying to stay strong," she said, "but every day I see more evidence that the family's interests aren't as clean as they pretend. I'm worried we're stepping into something we can't control." Brandon's gaze flicked around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I've had suspicions too, but I never dug deep. It's always been easier for me to distance myself, pretending I wasn't involved. I'm sorry I pulled you into this mess." She leaned against him briefly. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. "We have to." That evening, the family gathered in the drawing room for a mild celebration. Something about finalizing a deal on a new hotel property overseas. Waiters in crisp uniforms served sparkling water and cocktails while a few relatives toasted to the expansion. Grandfather was absent, supposedly traveling on business. The mood was festive for most, but Megan noticed the tension in certain corners of the room, the furtive glances between those uncles from the library. She forced a smile whenever someone looked her way, mindful of her posture and polite gestures. It was an exhausting dance, where everyone played a role. At one point, an aunt cornered Megan near the large fireplace, swirling her drink with barely veiled condescension. "So, how are the lessons coming along?" she asked. "You must realize the reputation of this family rests on how we present ourselves to the world." Megan kept her expression neutral. "I'm doing my best to learn quickly. I take our family's reputation seriously." The aunt's lips curved into a shallow smile. "Our family. Indeed." She looked as though she wanted to say more but decided against it, gliding away to chat with someone else. Megan exhaled, shoulders tense, feeling like she'd narrowly escaped a confrontation. By the time Megan and Brandon made it upstairs, she was bone-tired. Brandon kissed her goodnight at her suite door. "We'll talk more tomorrow," he promised. She closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding from the day's encounters. It felt as though every pair of eyes had been measuring her every breath, waiting for her to trip up. She changed into more comfortable clothes and turned off the lights. Moonlight fell through the curtains, painting soft patterns across the floor. Slowly, the mansion's nighttime hush settled in. A distant swirl of wind in the gardens, the gentle ticking of a clock down the hall. She finally allowed herself to relax into bed, one hand resting over the gentle curve of her belly, imagining the day she'd be free of these endless tests. But just as she sank into a drowsy state, she heard a rustle at the door. She sat up, heart hammering, unsure if it was just her imagination. A soft scraping sound followed, then silence. She flicked on the bedside lamp and crept across the room, opening the door a crack. Empty hallway, but there on the floor lay a crumpled piece of paper. She picked it up with trembling fingers, returning to the lamp's glow. Unfolding the note, she read a single, ominous sentence scrawled in a rushed hand. "Leave now, or you'll regret discovering our secrets." Megan gripped the folded note in her hand, heart pounding as she showed it to Brandon under the soft light of her bedroom lamp. The message, "Leave now or you'll regret discovering our secrets," rang in her ears, summoning a powerful mix of dread and determination. Brandon's face went pale, but he drew her into a quick embrace, whispering that they couldn't afford to back down. The next morning, they would head to the charity gala despite the threat, determined to show everyone that Megan could handle whatever tests came her way. Early the next day, they found a sleek black car waiting outside the mansion to ferry them to the event. Brandon settled beside Megan, his hand resting protectively on her belly. Though the ride was short, the tension felt endless. The gala, arranged by the family's philanthropic arm, promised a glittering display of wealth, glamorous but fraught with potential pitfalls. Megan recalled the instructions from the etiquette coach and the hush-hush warnings about how important this event was to the family's reputation. When they arrived, cameras flashed at the entrance to a grand ballroom studded with tall columns and glittering chandeliers. An imposing banner hung over the large doorway, naming the charitable cause of the evening. A string quartet played softly, giving the crowd of well-dressed guests a refined aura. Megan squeezed Brandon's arm for courage as they stepped onto the marble floor. She could feel the stares of reporters and society watchers assessing her appearance, searching for any sign she didn't belong. A polite attendant offered to take Megan's coat, and she handed it over, adjusting her gown, the most formal dress she owned, a flowing dark blue piece that clung comfortably around her middle. Brandon placed a warm hand at the small of her back, guiding her deeper into the crowd. They paused in front of a grand staircase where a family photographer was taking snapshots to commemorate the night. Megan forced a gracious smile, remembering to maintain the posture she'd practiced so often. She recognized a few faces from the estate, the jealous aunt who had criticized her at breakfast, a couple of distant cousins who'd barely acknowledged her existence, and even a pair of uncles she suspected might be involved in the family's murky dealings. Some greeted her with forced smiles, others merely offered curt nods. Everywhere guests chatted in glittering clusters, sipping champagne and exchanging polished pleasantries. A short while later, the event's host, a key figure from the charitable foundation, stepped onto a small stage and called for attention. He introduced the evening's focus, raising funds for educational programs in underprivileged communities. Megan listened carefully, her interest genuine. She'd always believed in community-based projects, and it occurred to her that this could be an opportunity to show her sincerity. If the family expected her to be only decorative, perhaps she could surprise them by bringing real passion to the cause. Glancing around, she spotted Brandon's grandfather in a tailored suit, shaking hands with a circle of VIPs. His gaze flicked over to her but quickly moved on, unreadable as ever. She tried not to let it rattle her, although it was impossible not to sense his silent evaluation. As the evening progressed, waiters circulated with hors d'oeuvres and drinks. Megan allowed herself a single glass of sparkling water, mindful of her pregnancy. She made polite small talk with a few guests, touched on her personal experiences helping with local food drives in her hometown, and found that people responded positively. Some even seemed genuinely impressed that she had practical ideas about community support rather than just parroting philanthropic jargon. In between these conversations, her eyes kept drifting to any sign of sabotage. The note's threat left her hyper-aware of each unfamiliar face, every open door leading to darker corridors. She heard a hiss of her name and turned to find an older woman with a tight smile, urging her to meet someone across the room. The older woman turned out to be the aunt who had once sneered at her. Now, though, the aunt seemed strangely eager to parade Megan around, introducing her to prominent figures like she was a prized showpiece. Megan went along graciously, even though it felt uncomfortably performative. During one such introduction, a server passed by, carrying a silver tray loaded with delicate wine glasses. Without warning, a guest nearby stumbled, sending the tray clattering toward Megan. She gasped, bracing herself for a drenching of red wine, or worse, a shattered glass underfoot that might make her slip. But at the last second, Brandon appeared behind her, steadying the tray and preventing disaster. A few droplets splashed onto her dress, leaving faint stains, but the potential accident was mostly averted. The server apologized profusely, though something about the misstep felt off to Megan. An accident, perhaps, or an attempt to make her look clumsy. Brandon brushed the droplets from her gown, pressing a comforting hand to her arm. She noticed an uptick in whispers around them. A small accident was all it took to feed speculation. Shaken, she let Brandon guide her toward a quieter corner. "That couldn't have been random," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder. "Somebody wants me humiliated." He exhaled. "We need to be on guard. But let's not panic. The best thing is to keep going, show we're not afraid." She nodded, straightening her posture before rejoining the crowd. Eventually, a hush spread across the ballroom as Brandon's grandfather mounted the stage. Lights reflected off the silver threads of his suit as he launched into a speech about the family's legacy of giving, highlighting the hotel empire's philanthropic track record. Megan listened carefully, noticing the confident tone and the surface-level sincerity. The speech listed expansions and charitable partnerships, painting a picture of generosity. Yet she couldn't forget the secrets lurking behind some of those deals. She forced a polite smile when he gestured in her direction, acknowledging her presence in front of the crowd for the first time that evening. Applause thundered, but she detected something tense in the audience's undertone, as if half the family waited for her to misstep. As the speech concluded, Megan excused herself to find a restroom, slipping past clusters of chatting guests. The hallway outside the main ballroom was softly lit, its walls adorned with promotional posters for the charitable cause. At the far end, she spotted two men in suits deep in conversation. Recognizing them as family executives, she ducked behind a pillar, curious about the heated whispers she heard. "How will we keep funneling the money if these new proposals get traction?" hissed one, gripping a rolled document in his fist. "We can't keep running side deals if the public starts demanding accountability." "We won't let that happen," the other said through clenched teeth. "Look at tonight. Everything's polished. We're still in control. If that woman, Brandon's wife, tries to dig deeper, we'll handle it." Megan's heart pounded. This was the second time she'd caught wind of shady financial machinations, and they specifically mentioned her. It took all her willpower not to confront them right there. Instead, she eased back, returning swiftly to the ballroom. If there was any doubt about the family's ethical standing, it had vanished now. Danger lay in every corner of these gleaming rooms. Determined not to break down, she pasted on a smile and returned to the center of the gala, navigating small talk with donors, learning a bit more about their interests. A woman representing a real nonprofit approached Megan, praising her thoughtful comments about community empowerment. The praise felt genuine, and Megan's spirits lifted. Despite the undercurrent of threats and sabotage, she might still make a positive impression tonight. Near the end of the evening, glasses were refilled for the final toast. The host returned to the stage, inviting key family members and benefactors up front to share a moment of solidarity. Megan stayed in the crowd, politely clapping as Brandon's grandfather took the mic once more, praising the event's success and the generosity of all in attendance. Applause rippled through the ballroom. On the surface, it was a triumphant scene, a testament to the family's charitable face. Beneath that veneer, Megan felt something far more precarious, the knowledge that one misstep could ruin her, or that one more uncovering of corruption could provoke real danger. When the formalities ended, people began filtering toward the exit, collecting coats and waving to photographers outside. Brandon guided Megan past a swarm of guests, smiling politely at well-wishers. She could sense the faint quiver in his hand against her back, both of them exhausted by the night's balancing act. Just as they neared the door, Megan glanced over her shoulder and locked eyes with the grandfather, standing near a marble pillar. He studied her intently, his expression unreadable except for the faint narrowing of his gaze. In that moment, she realized how close to the edge they all were. Her place in the family, Brandon's inheritance, the hidden corruption. It was all swirling around them, spinning faster than ever. As they exited the gala, Megan spotted the grandfather watching her intently. His eyes seemed to say, "Pass this test or lose everything." She realized she was caught in a far bigger game than she ever imagined. Megan woke up the morning after the gala with a renewed sense of purpose. The threat hovering over her and Brandon was real, but something had shifted inside her. She was tired of living on the defensive. The night before, she had seen firsthand how hollow the family's charitable facade could be, and it made her certain there was a better way to use the resources at their disposal. She might be battling the grandfather's strict traditions, the suspicious uncles, and every disapproving aunt, but that didn't mean she had to sit idle. After dressing, she found Brandon in a small study off the main corridor, going through papers on a wide mahogany desk. He looked up, relief softening his features when he spotted her. She shut the door carefully behind her, mindful of possible eavesdroppers. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly, crossing the room. He shook his head. "Kept thinking about the gala, that near accident with the wine glasses, the stairs. I can't shake the feeling that someone's trying to force you out." Megan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I feel it too, but I don't plan to leave." She squared her shoulders. "I'm actually thinking about a social project, something that can help local communities while connecting to the family's hotels. If we can show real impact, it might prove I'm serious about staying, and it might help if certain people are worried about the family's public image." Brandon stared at her, a spark of hope in his eyes. "That's an incredible idea. You've always been great at bridging people's needs with resources." She allowed herself a small smile. "I'll need your help. We'll have to tread carefully. I don't think everyone in this family wants positive scrutiny on their business practices." His smile faded slightly. "I'm with you, but be cautious." They worked quietly for a while, brainstorming ideas. Megan recalled her days volunteering at a community center, how job training programs had transformed many lives. She envisioned something similar for the hospitality industry, giving underprivileged youth or unemployed adults a chance to learn hotel management, cooking, housekeeping, and reception skills. Brandon typed notes on his laptop, creating a rough outline to present. Before they could get too deep into details, a faint knock sounded at the study door. They exchanged a quick glance. Brandon closed his laptop and Megan tucked the paper notes into a folder. When Brandon opened the door, a younger cousin peered inside with a hesitant smile. "Morning," the cousin said, stepping in carefully. "I heard you two were in here. I wanted to let you know grandfather's having a small meeting in the salon soon. Something about the family's hotel expansions." Megan nodded, but her mind was already racing. This meeting could be an opportunity to gauge the family's reaction to a new idea. Even if they were skeptical, at least she'd plant the seed. The cousin seemed to sense her excitement, brows knitting in curiosity. "Just be careful," the cousin murmured. "I know you're trying to prove yourself, but not everyone wants the kind of changes you might suggest." Megan thanked the cousin, and once they left, she and Brandon shared a silent moment of resolve. Shortly afterward, they joined the family in the lavish salon, a high-ceilinged room flanked by tall windows that let in a flood of morning light. The older relatives sat on plush chairs, sipping tea or coffee. A stern uncle spoke about overseas properties while an aunt praised the successful gala donations. Their words held a glow of self-congratulation that made Megan's stomach knot. She slid into a chair near the fringes, feeling their gazes flick over her. Brandon cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "We've been thinking about a way to boost the family's public image, something more direct than just attending galas." He glanced at Megan. "Megan has a proposal." The entire room seemed to fix on her. Heart thumping, she sat forward. "I'd like to start a pilot program at one of our hotels, something that offers training and jobs to disadvantaged communities. We could partner with local nonprofits or schools. It would give people the chance to learn valuable hospitality skills, and at the same time, the hotel benefits from fresh talent." An immediate wave of muttering rolled through the room. One of the uncles, the same man Megan had overheard whispering about questionable financial moves, looked unimpressed. "Sounds like a lot of extra costs," he said with a dismissive wave. "We already have staff. Why complicate operations?" Megan forced a calm expression. "It wouldn't be complicated. We'd start small, offering a handful of training slots. Local businesses might even sponsor them if we show the potential impact." A crisp cough came from an older aunt in the corner. "It's a sweet notion, dear, but is it truly aligned with the high-end reputation of our hotels? We cater to elite clientele." Megan refused to buckle. "That's exactly why it could work. Show we aren't just about profit, but about community uplift. Improving our corporate social responsibility can enhance the family's brand." and protect us from scandals." Her words carried a hint of warning she hoped they'd catch. Brandon nodded, adding, "A well-publicized program would bring in positive coverage. It might even attract new clientele who value socially responsible businesses." The relatives exchanged uneasy looks. They seemed torn between the potential public relations benefit and their deep-seated reluctance to let an outsider like Megan dictate family policy. Then the grandfather, who had been silent by the window, turned around. He slowly crossed the room, the quiet taps of his polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. He regarded Megan with a cool air. "We'll consider your idea. I'll ask for more details, costs, and expected outcomes. If it's worthwhile, we can authorize a trial. But make no mistake," he added, voice carrying a steely edge, "if this program fails or damages our business, you'll be held responsible." Megan met his gaze head-on. "Understood," she said, breath catching in her throat. Soon, the meeting dissolved. While a few relatives drifted out, the suspicious uncle brushed past Megan, muttering, "Don't think we don't see what you're doing. You're meddling in affairs you know nothing about." She swallowed her retort, watching him storm off. Brandon touched her arm. "It's a start," he whispered. "We'll make them see this is a good idea." In the days that followed, Megan worked tirelessly. She reached out to a small nonprofit that specialized in vocational training, holding secret phone calls in her suite to avoid prying ears. The younger cousin helped gather information about the family's existing philanthropic arm, though their documentation was frustratingly sparse and possibly doctored to hide shady deals. Megan hoped her project would shine some light on the family's better side, giving them a reason to move away from clandestine practices. But sabotage soon reared its head. Documents she had prepared, early outlines of potential partnerships and cost breakdowns, vanished from her desk one morning. She searched everywhere, frantic, before concluding someone had taken them. She hurried to Brandon's office, breathless. "It's gone!" she exclaimed, anxiety flaring. "All the notes for the pilot program. There's no other copy." Brandon's expression darkened. "Someone wants to shut this down before it even starts. We'll reconstruct it," he promised, opening his laptop. "We'll put the details in a secure folder this time, and we'll keep the paperwork locked away." Megan nodded, feeling the twins kick as if urging her to push forward. This only proves we're on the right track. Still, her back tensed every time she left her room. She never knew who might be listening, rifling through her belongings, or waiting to sabotage her plans again. A nasty confrontation took place in the main hallway. A frosty aunt who had once mocked Megan's etiquette cornered her, insisting that this pet project was causing gossip. "People are saying you're poking around too much, dear. Maybe it's time you focused on your pregnancy and let the rest of us handle the family business." Megan held her ground. "It's our family business now, mine and Brandon's. I'm not stepping back." The aunt's sneer twisted her features before she briskly walked away. Megan forced herself to exhale. Deep down, she knew the hostility was rising to a dangerous level. Late one afternoon, while updating the second draft of her proposal on Brandon's computer, Megan felt a sudden pang in her lower back, so sharp that she gasped. Brandon rushed to her side, worry etched on his face. She eased herself into a chair, hands trembling around her belly. "Are you okay?" he asked, tone urgent. She took a few careful breaths. I think it's just stress," she admitted, heart still pounding. "But this can't be good for the twins." He pressed a gentle hand to her shoulder. "We'll slow down, find a more balanced approach. I don't want you harming yourself." She nodded, blinking back tears. "We have to keep going," she whispered, "but I'll be careful." That night, after managing to reassemble most of her documents and lock them safely in a drawer, Megan finally fell into bed, her body aching. She'd left Brandon in the study, making more secure copies on a private server. Sleep came slowly, haunted by thoughts of who might be trying to derail her efforts or whether someone else would sabotage them again. Then, in the small hours of the morning, her phone buzzed. She fumbled for it on the nightstand, blinking at the glare. An unknown number. She opened the message, her breath catching in her throat at the words "Stark" against the screen. Stop now, or the next accident might not be an accident. Megan read the anonymous message on her phone over and over until the words blurred. She barely slept after that, her mind swirling with images of sabotage and hidden threats. By dawn, she felt more determined than ever to push forward with her social project, no matter what danger lurked behind the mansion's ornate walls. If she gave up, the corruption would remain buried, and Brandon's inheritance, along with any real chance of change, would vanish. That morning, she joined Brandon for breakfast in a smaller sitting room to avoid the usual cold stares from certain relatives. The windows there overlooked a trimmed hedge maze in the distance, light streaming through in soft stripes across the parquet floor. She stirred her tea absently, recalling the text's warning. Stop now, or the next accident might not be an accident. Brandon, across from her, scanned the local news on his tablet, shoulders tense. Any more threats? He asked, glancing at her phone. She shook her head. No new ones, but I can't shake the feeling someone's waiting for the right moment to strike again. We can't let that intimidate us. He reached across the table, covering her hand gently. Then we keep going. We finish what we started. His protective gaze flicked toward her belly. We'll make sure you and the twins stay safe. Before long, they headed to the estate's main office suite, where a few of the family's higher-ups were scheduled to meet. Megan clutched the folder containing her refined proposal, pages that outlined how the pilot program would offer training and job placements for underserved communities at one of the family-owned hotels. Though she'd reconstructed the documents after the earlier theft, she remained extra cautious, refusing to let this version out of her sight. They entered the boardroom, a space with high windows and a polished table that seemed to stretch forever. Seated around it were the faces Megan had come to know all too well. Brandon's uncles, an aunt or two with pinched expressions, and a couple of neutral-faced executives. The grandfather's chair at the head was empty. Apparently he had not yet arrived or was choosing to come in his own time. Brandon cleared his throat, motioning for Megan to begin. She rose, stepping to the front of the table. The hush fell instantly. She knew they were ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. Summoning her composure, she explained the structure of the project, how it would select participants, the costs, the logistical needs. She focused on showing how this pilot might elevate the family's public standing, while also creating genuine social impact. As she spoke, the uncles exchanged looks. One of them, the one who always seemed to hover near suspicious financial dealings, chimed in first. This all sounds very noble, but it's also expensive and time-consuming. Why should we divert resources to train outsiders? Megan swallowed back her nerves. Because it will pay off in positive publicity, not to mention the goodwill it fosters. I've included potential partnerships with nonprofits, and there's a chance for government grants. This isn't just a handout. It's an investment in a better skilled workforce. An aunt, carefully coiffed and perpetually disapproving, raised a manicured eyebrow. I suppose you've confirmed these partnerships? Megan nodded, passing out copies of her plan. I've spoken with 2 nonprofits specializing in vocational training. They're eager to collaborate. This approach could also help us recruit dedicated, long-term employees for our hotels. She glanced around the table. It's a pilot, yes. But if it succeeds, we'll have a model we can adapt to other properties. She fielded a few more questions, some genuine, others pointedly designed to unsettle her. Through it all, she kept her voice steady, noticing that a number of the executives seemed curious, even cautiously supportive. Then the door opened, and in strode the grandfather, pausing to observe from the back of the room. His presence cast a chill over the meeting. Megan concluded her explanation, holding her breath as the room turned to him. He approached with measured steps, hands clasped behind his back. His gaze flicked to the paperwork, then to Megan. "Well," he began slowly, "I see you have been busy." She forced herself to meet his eyes, heart thrumming. "Yes, we believe this program can only benefit the family business." He scanned the expressions around the table. A few relatives coughed. One or two avoided his stare. Finally, he gave a single nod. "Very well. Prepare a more detailed budget. Present it to me in a week. If it looks feasible, we'll approve a trial." He leveled a sharp look at Megan. "But remember, if it fails, or if it costs more than it's worth, responsibility falls squarely on your shoulders." Her gut twisted. Still, a wave of relief washed over her. "Thank you," she murmured. It was a conditional approval, but a victory nonetheless. As the meeting concluded, some of the aunts and uncles drifted away, discussing other business in hushed tones. Brandon touched Megan's elbow lightly, guiding her toward the exit. She was about to exhale a sigh of triumph when a hand clamped around her wrist. She turned to face the suspicious uncle, his eyes narrowed in a mix of anger and warning. "Don't get ahead of yourself," he hissed. "You might think you've won them over, but there are forces in this family you can't handle." Before she could reply, he released her, slipping out into the hallway. Brandon put an arm around her protectively, but she could feel her pulse hammering. If there was any doubt about how far someone might go to sabotage her, it vanished in that moment. Danger was real, and it was closing in. That afternoon, she and Brandon began detailed planning for the pilot launch. They selected a smaller hotel on the outskirts of the city, less risky than a flagship property. Rosa, the helpful maid who'd once brought Megan tea, discreetly offered to put them in touch with local community leaders she knew. Megan jotted down names, thankful for an inside source she could trust. Every step forward felt like a small triumph, but also a call for more caution. By late evening, as Megan finished checking off items on her to-do list in the quiet study, Brandon peeked in. "I have to head into the city for a day or two," he said. "I'll meet with the nonprofits in person, finalize details. We need them on board formally." She stood, concern tugging at her. "Travel? With tension so high?" He brushed a light kiss against her forehead. "We can't stall. I'll be careful. Just promise me you'll watch your back here." "Of course," she murmured, heart in her throat. She hated being apart from him now, but it made sense. They needed progress, and the nonprofits were less likely to be intimidated by distant phone calls. The next morning, Brandon left. Megan spent the day preparing preliminary materials, schedules, training outlines, and official letters. Exhausted but resolute, she took a break in the courtyard that afternoon, breathing in fresh air. A tranquil fountain splashed at the center, but her mind wouldn't still. She sensed eyes on her. The moment she turned, a man in a dark suit vanished behind a column. Her pulse spiked. Who was spying on her now? That evening, she decided to drive to the hotel site herself, to review the layout for training. The roads were quiet, the sky a pale lavender as sunset approached. She pulled into the hotel's lot, stepping out to greet the manager who'd agreed to meet her. They walked through the lobby, discussing space for workshops and a possible break room for trainees. Megan took careful notes. Just as they finished, she heard a metallic scraping sound from somewhere outside. On her way back to the car, the sun sinking low, she spotted a figure darting around a corner. Alarm prickled. She rushed to her vehicle only to find a thick shard of metal wedged behind a front tire, sharp enough to slash the rubber if she'd driven off. She froze, hands shaking. Had she left the car for too long? If she hadn't noticed, a blowout on the highway could have been catastrophic, especially while pregnant. Clutching her phone, she called for roadside assistance instead of risking the drive. Anger and fear swirled in her chest. Someone in the family, or on their payroll, had escalated their sabotage. She realized she was fortunate to have spotted it. Another near miss. Another warning. When Megan finally returned to the estate hours later, The sky was ink black, stars shining cold overhead. She stepped inside, crossing the silent foyer. With every footstep echoing off the marble, her mind replayed the day's events. Her precarious victory in the boardroom, the sabotage attempt at the hotel, and the sense that each success of hers only fueled someone's desire to see her fail. She trudged upstairs, passing the darkened corridor that led to the library. Something moved at the edge of her vision, a shadow slipping away. She tensed, but it didn't return. Her sweet door felt like sanctuary when she stepped inside and locked it behind her. After hours of tension and travel, she wanted nothing more than to rest. But on her nightstand was a folded slip of paper, placed too neatly to be an accident. She opened it with trembling hands and recognized the handwriting at once. It belonged to the younger cousin who'd shown her hints of kindness before. "I know who's behind this. Meet me in secret tonight." Megan's heart thumped as she stood in her dimly lit suite, rereading the cousin's note. "I know who's behind this. Meet me in secret tonight." She had half expected another threat. Instead, it felt like a lifeline. Maybe now she could finally piece together the twisted puzzle haunting her since she'd arrived at the estate. She slipped the paper into her pocket, certain that whoever scrawled that message was risking just as much as she was. She waited impatiently for the hour to grow late, replaying in her mind the moments that brought her here. Anonymous notes, near accidents, whispers of embezzlement. Brandon was still out of town finalizing the social project deals, and she felt his absence acutely. The silence in the mansion at night weighed heavily on her, every footstep echoing through the halls. Whenever she heard the faintest rustle, her heart leapt. At last, just after midnight, she ventured into the corridor. The chandeliers were dimmed, and the only light came from flickering sconces that cast long shadows on the marble floor. She kept her footsteps light, conscious of how the twins tensed within her belly whenever she grew anxious. Still, she moved carefully, hoping no watchful eyes trailed her tonight. She made her way down a staircase and around a corner, following the faint glow of moonlight through a tall window. A figure waited near a side entrance, a slight silhouette in the gloom. Megan recognized the slender posture and anxious energy of her younger cousin. The cousin beckoned her closer, glancing around before ushering Megan outside into the garden. Crickets chirped softly in the night air, and the moon painted silver stripes across the manicured hedges. The cousin led her into a small greenhouse tucked among leafy shrubs. Inside, the warm air smelled of damp soil and greenery. A single overhead bulb glowed, revealing rows of potted plants and a narrow bench. Megan's cousin shut the greenhouse door with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry to drag you out here," the cousin said in a hushed tone, "but it's the only place we can talk without being overheard, especially by certain relatives." Megan studied the cousin's face, noticing the tightness around the eyes. "What do you know?" she asked softly. "Who's behind the threats and the sabotage?" The cousin swallowed hard. "I found some documents. At first I was just curious about how the family money was managed, but then I saw references to offshore accounts, unexplained transfers, and the same name kept popping up as the one authorizing them." The cousin's voice wavered. "It's our uncle, the one who's always looking over your shoulder and sneering at your proposals. He's siphoning funds out of the hotels. I think he's terrified your social project will expose the financial records. That's why he's trying to push you out, by any means." Megan felt a surge of both relief and dread. She suspected that uncle all along, but hearing it confirmed sent chills through her. "He must be the one orchestrating the accidents," she muttered, "trying to make me leave or fail so no one digs deeper." The cousin nodded, rummaging in a satchel slung over one shoulder. "I copied some of the documents. They're cryptic, but enough to show he's hiding illicit dealings. I even found a few references suggesting hush money was paid out to keep certain people quiet." A piece of paper appeared in the cousin's trembling hand. Megan peered at it by the faint glow of the greenhouse bulb. reading line after line of coded transactions. Though incomplete, the pattern was unmistakable. Large sums disappearing into shadowy company names. Her breath caught at the risk the cousin must have taken to get these copies. "This is dangerous," she whispered, looking up. "If he catches you with this—" The cousin pressed their lips together, eyes reflecting equal parts fear and resolve. "I know, but I can't watch him sabotage you, or keep stealing from the family while everyone pretends not to see. You're the only one with the courage to stand up to him. We need you." Emotion tightened Megan's throat. She thought of Brandon, of the twins. This was bigger than inheritance now. She was entangled in corruption that could bring the entire empire down if left unchecked. "Thank you," she managed. "But how do we confront him? If we go public, Brandon loses everything, and that uncle won't hesitate to escalate his threats." The cousin frowned. "We have to be strategic. Gather enough proof so that if we reveal it, your uncle can't talk his way out. And we have to do it through grandfather, or someone powerful enough to stop him. But it has to happen soon, before he gets more desperate." They fell silent for a moment, the only sound the soft drip of water in the greenhouse's irrigation system. Megan felt the weight of her predicament pressing down. One misstep, and she could ruin Brandon's inheritance or put her and the cousin in real danger. "I can't wait for Brandon to come back," she whispered. "This might worsen at any moment." The cousin touched her arm. "He'll be back in a day or two, right? We can at least gather everything we have, organize it, and plan how to bring it to grandfather without alerting your uncle." Megan nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. "Yes, that's our best chance." They parted cautiously, returning to the mansion by separate paths. Megan slipped into her suite, heart hammering, the stolen documents clutched tightly. She spent the rest of the night pacing, her mind racing with possibilities. If this proof came to light, the uncle would surely lash out, but letting him continue unchallenged would be worse. Morning arrived, and Megan ventured to the family library. This time, she combed through the dusty records systematically, searching for confirmation that her uncle had manipulated financial ledgers. She found tiny discrepancies, numbers that didn't match statements, suspicious placeholders that suggested certain funds had been lost during expansions. Each small detail felt like a new puzzle piece. She typed notes into her phone, glancing over her shoulder whenever footsteps passed the door. At midday, she retreated to the courtyard, grateful for the open sky. The tranquil bubble of the fountain offered a moment's solace. She scrolled through her messages, longing for one from Brandon confirming he'd return soon. She needed his steady presence, someone to help plan the next step. Around 2 in the afternoon, a distant relative approached with furrowed brows. "You're wanted in the dining room," they said curtly. "Your uncle called an urgent family lunch." A jolt of worry shot through her. This was the same uncle who'd threatened her. Had he caught wind that she was close to exposing him? She collected herself and headed inside. In the dining room, a handful of relatives lingered around a polished table laden with a midday spread. The uncle in question stood at the head, arms crossed. He barely waited for her to sit before launching into a thinly veiled criticism of her pilot program. "Costs are spiking," he claimed, though no official budget had soared. "We must reconsider this idea of yours. It's proving more trouble than it's worth." Megan forced a polite smile. "I'm finalizing the plan with grandfather next week. I'd be happy to show you the updated figures." He waved a dismissive hand. "Brandon's wife or not, you have no authority to push us into irresponsible deals. Our brand is about exclusivity, not social experiments." Tension crackled across the table. A cousin tried to intervene, only to be silenced by the uncle's glare. Megan felt her pulse quicken, but she held her ground. "We're hardly pushing anything irresponsible. I have partnerships lined up." "Enough," he set his jaw. "We're calling another family council soon. If you can't present a flawless case, don't bother showing up." She recognized the threat beneath his tone, the unspoken promise that he wouldn't hesitate to sabotage her again if need be. but she only nodded, stepping away from the table as soon as politeness allowed. Late that evening, she hurried to her suite, locking the door behind her. She retrieved the cousin's documents from a hidden spot in her dresser, spreading them out on a small desk. Dates, amounts, names of shell companies. It all pointed to a sophisticated operation. She typed up notes on her phone, cross-referencing what she'd found in the library. Every new connection made her breath catch. The scale of it was bigger than she'd realized. Someone tapped on her door, startling her. She scrambled to hide the files, heart pounding. "Who is it?" "It's me," called the younger cousin. Megan cautiously opened the door. The cousin slipped inside, face tense. "I have more evidence," they whispered, holding up a USB drive. "Emails, scanned documents, enough to take this to the authorities if we must." Megan carefully accepted it, feeling as though she held a loaded weapon. "This could bring him down," she breathed. The cousin nodded. "And blow up the family's name if it goes public. It's your choice how to proceed. But if we do nothing, he'll keep coming for you." A sudden commotion sounded from the corridor, and the cousin paled. "I'll go. Be careful." They slipped out, leaving Megan alone with the evidence. She paced, trying to calm the panic swirling in her mind. Now that she had the means to unmask the sabotage, did she dare? If this scandal erupted, Brandon's entire inheritance, and possibly the family fortune, could be revoked, and the uncle wouldn't hesitate to strike back. Before she could decide, a heavy knock rattled the door. She opened it to find Brandon's grandfather, unannounced and grim-faced. The intensity in his eyes made her throat go dry. "Your uncle's been ranting about sabotage," he said coldly, stepping into the room. "I want the truth. Is there anything you need to tell me?" Megan's pulse thundered. "Grandfather, He scanned her desk, noticing the half-hidden documents. In 2 strides, he was upon them, sharp gaze darting across the incriminating lines. When he looked up, fury swirled in his eyes. "If this is true, the entire legacy teeters on the edge," he rasped, "and it'll be on your shoulders to prove it." Dawn broke over the estate, pale light filtering through heavy drapes as the household stirred with an unfamiliar tension. Relatives rushed through corridors in hushed conversation. Every face was marked by a mixture of worry and curiosity, for they all knew a family council had been summoned at first light, and that Megan would be at the center of it. She stood in front of her mirror, smoothing the wrinkles in her dress while pressing a palm to the curve of her belly. The twins seemed just as restless as she was. Her reflection showed determination laced with anxiety. She reminded herself that everything she had endured, every etiquette lesson, every cold glare, every threat, had led to this moment. She would stand tall, no matter the outcome. Brandon appeared at her door, eyes filled with concern. She felt an instant lift at the sight of him. He had returned just hours before, exhausted from finalizing the partnership deals for the social project. But now they were together again, poised to bring the truth to light. "It's time," he said softly, touching her elbow. "Grandfather wants us all in the conference hall." She grabbed the folder of incriminating documents, including the cousin's USB drive. The evidence felt heavier than its physical weight, a secret that could shake the family's empire to its core. She and Brandon exchanged a resolute nod before stepping into the corridor. The conference hall was spacious, with a polished table that glinted in the morning sun. High-backed chairs lined its perimeter, nearly every seat occupied by a relative or executive. Grandfather stood at the head, spine rigid, an expression of granite etched into his features. The suspicious uncle loomed at his side, arms folded, eyes locked on Megan with open hostility. As soon as Megan and Brandon entered, the low hum of anxious voices died. She could feel their stares but forced herself to walk calmly to the front of the room, setting the folder on the table. The hush was deafening. Even the steady tick of the grandfather's antique clock seemed muffled, as if time itself paused in anticipation. "Tell them what you told me," grandfather instructed, voice stern. He stood slightly aside, allowing Megan to command the room's focus. She drew a breath. Some of you know I've been working on a social training pilot program for our hotels. In doing so, I discovered irregularities in our financial records. Transfers to offshore accounts, large sums unaccounted for, suspicious placeholders. They all point to one person. She turned her gaze on the uncle, and it appears he orchestrated threats against me to keep this hidden. A ripple of shock ran through the assembly. Relatives leaned forward in their chairs, some exchanging startled looks, others covering their mouths with trembling hands. An elder aunt spoke first, voice quavering, "Are you certain of this?" Megan nodded, resisting the impulse to look at Brandon for reassurance. "I have copies of the ledgers, bank statements, and email threads. If you don't believe me, see for yourselves." She lifted the folder, presenting the pages. "This is only part of what was uncovered." A furious hiss escaped the uncle's lips. "Lies," he growled, slamming his hand down on the table. "She forged these documents to sabotage me. And Brandon, he's just trying to stake his claim no matter who he destroys." Brandon stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "Stop it. We've seen what you're doing. You've been funneling money out of the hotel group for your personal gain, and you tried to intimidate Megan into leaving, hoping no one would question you." Outrage sparked around the table. People demanded to see the evidence. The tension soared as Megan and Brandon distributed the papers, letting them read through each damning figure. Voices rose in confusion or anger. The uncle spluttered, trying to defend himself, but the numbers spoke too loudly. Every page revealed more proof of his hidden dealings. Grandfather rapped his knuckles on the table, commanding silence. "Enough!" he thundered. His gaze flicked from the documents to the uncle, then to Megan. "I demanded the truth, and now it's here. You," he said, directing an icy glare at the uncle, "have betrayed this family more than any outsider could." The uncle bristled, face reddening, but seemed at a loss for words. Rage and desperation burned in his eyes. Slowly, Grandfather turned toward Megan, a mixture of sternness and grudging respect crossing his features. "Perhaps I was too quick to judge you," he said in a low voice. "I see now that your honesty may be the only thing saving us from a far greater scandal." Then, before the entire room, he directed his next words to the uncle. "You are stripped of any authority in this family business. If legal steps must be taken, so be it." A shocked hush followed, broken only by the uncle's stammered protests. Several family members looked relieved, while others gaped at Megan in astonishment. A glint of triumph shone in Brandon's eyes, mixed with awe at her courage. She felt her pulse pounding, a fierce sense of justice welling up after so many weeks of uncertainty and fear. At the table's far end, an older cousin cleared their throat. "In light of these revelations, perhaps we should reconsider Megan's program in a more supportive light. It could help repair the public trust that might waver after the news breaks." Another aunt, who had once belittled Megan, nodded reluctantly. "Given the circumstances, yes, a well-structured social project might be exactly what we need right now." Megan blinked, hardly believing this shift in attitude. Brandon clasped her hand under the table, silently acknowledging how quickly the tide could turn once truth prevailed. Grandfather surveyed the room, his hawk-like gaze scanning each relative in turn. "If we are to preserve what is good in this family, we must also repair what is broken," he announced. "Megan, Brandon, prepare to bring your proposal to the press. We'll show the world our commitment to doing things right from now on." A murmur of agreement rose, and Megan exhaled a trembling breath. The uncle glowered, cornered, and left the room with a snarl, likely knowing all eyes would be on him from now on. Quiet conversations resumed, shifting from scandal to solutions, from suspicion to acceptance. That afternoon, once the shock had settled, Megan and Brandon contacted the nonprofit partners. They arranged a small press gathering to announce the pilot project. Cameras flashed as they stood on the manor's steps, side by side, speaking earnestly about helping underprivileged communities gain skills and employment. Journalists asked pointed questions about rumors of family strife, But Megan and Brandon faced them with calm resolve. Grandfather, for once, stood off to the side, neither interfering nor undermining Megan. His presence was subdued, thoughtful, as though witnessing that perhaps he had found someone truly worthy of carrying on the family legacy. When the press event ended, a sense of relief took hold. Megan slipped a hand over her belly, feeling the twins shift. There was a final echo of adrenaline in her limbs, but also hope. The staff milled around, some offering shy smiles or words of congratulations. For the first time, Megan felt part of the estate's living pulse, not just an intruder. Later, in the privacy of their suite, Megan sank onto a chair, exhaling a deep breath. Brandon knelt before her, pressing a palm gently against her abdomen. "We did it," he whispered. "Or at least we took the biggest step." She nodded, eyes shining with tears of relief. "I just want a future here that's honest. For us. For them." She gestured at her belly. Brandon rose and leaned in, wrapping her in a tender embrace. She closed her eyes, content for a moment simply to breathe in the closeness. Early the next morning, she had a routine checkup, and the doctor's calming presence offered reassurance. "You're handling the stress well," the doctor said, performing a careful ultrasound. "Everything looks normal for twins at this stage." Megan's eyes prickled with gratitude, the steady rhythm of 2 little heartbeats echoing in the monitor like a promise. That same morning, she received word that grandfather wanted to see her in his study. She found him in a large leather chair, gazing at an old family portrait. He set it aside when she entered and studied her face. "I see now," he began, "that testing you so harshly could have driven you away. But you stood firm. You've done more to protect this family's name than some who were born into it." Megan inclined her head, unsure how to respond. But he continued, offering a nod of grudging approval. "I wouldn't blame you if you left after all this," he said quietly. "But I hope you'll stay. It seems we need you, and Brandon, if we're to chart a better path forward." Emotion welled in Megan, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "We'll stay," she assured him, "but we do it on honest terms." He gave a barely perceptible smile, then turned back to the portrait. After a respectful pause, Megan excused herself, feeling a weight lift from her chest. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was something. A new openness. A few days later, the household braced for yet another family portrait, this time to replace an older one in the main hall. Relatives lined up, some shifting awkwardly. Brandon stood at Megan's side, hand intertwined with hers, while the staff hovered in doorways, curious to watch this symbolic moment. The grand photographer arranged everyone, lighting them up with a series of soft flashes. Megan smiled, feeling the twins give gentle kicks, as though cheering her on. When it was over, laughter rippled through the group, tense at first, then softening into something warmer. Some relatives gravitated toward Megan, uttering congratulatory remarks or offering polite apologies for past slights. She felt a mixture of relief and guarded optimism, but it was better than the icy hostility she once faced. With the press swirling about the pilot program, her name was now tied to a cause that genuinely mattered to her. Staff whispered that the mansion's strict traditions might loosen, making space for more collaboration and transparency. Megan felt a cautious hope brewing in every corner of the estate, like a dawn rising over the once shadowed halls. As the day wound down, she and Brandon stepped outside to catch a breath of fresh air. Standing on the terrace, they watched sunlight dance over the manicured lawns. He slipped an arm around her. "We've come a long way," he murmured. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the twins stretch and nudge. "We have," she agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. For the first time since she discovered Brandon's secret fortune, she felt genuinely at peace, as though they'd begun writing a chapter of their own within the family's storied past. A flicker of movement caught her eye. She turned to see grandfather in an upstairs window, observing them. Instead of the usual sternness, there was a nod of acknowledgement. She returned a small smile, silently acknowledging that trust might grow here. even if it was still fragile. While the sun dipped lower, painting the sky gold, Megan sensed the babies moving in a rhythmic dance. She met Brandon's gaze, heart brimming with anticipation for what lay ahead. Their world, once overshadowed by secrets and threats, now sparkled with the promise of a more hopeful legacy. In the last rays of light, Megan felt the twins kicking harder than ever. She exchanged a meaningful look with Brandon, aware that their story had only just begun, and that the future, no longer clouded by hidden fortunes and internal sabotage, now gleamed with genuine possibility for them all. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.